Hello, everybody. I'm Chris. I'm a grandfather, as some of you like to call me, which is very nice. And I'm the author of Poetry Changes Lives. Thank you for coming to this live show this evening. I have done some before, but everyone is a new experience. I wrote this book that I'm holding, Poetry Changes Lives. This is the hardcover version, which I think makes a very nice presentation copy. There is also a paperback, which has been out for some time, which is here. But I like the hardcover version. I'm going to talk today about the poetry of wartime, which I think is appropriate because it's Remembrance Week, and poetry and war, sadly, has been a sort of eternal facet of poetry ever since poetry, certainly in the Western world, was begun at the time of Homer getting on for 3,000 years ago. You know, that was about poetry. Of course, love is the other great theme, and they're both present in Homer, and they've been present ever since, right up to today. So the plan is I'm going to talk about the poetry of war, how it can be used as a weapon of war or inspiration for war, and how it can also be used for peace and reconciliation and healing. And we're going to have a question and answer session about halfway through, and maybe another one at the end. And I'm here with my friend James, who's helping me today.
Hello there.
Here's James. Thanks for coming, James. And so, first of all, I'm just going to give you an idea of what goes on in my book. I'm going to read one of the entries, which each day I mention a historical event, and then a poem connected with it, and then a thought for the day. And since the theme today is poetry of war, I've chosen this day, which is actually September the 12th, which talks about war. On this day in 510 BC, the Athenian army, we're back in ancient Greece here, under the clever general Miltiades, defeated a much larger Persian army at the Battle of Marathon. Marathon, of course, is a place in the Greek mainland. Miltiades had previously served in the Persian army and knew the tactics they used. He ordered the Athenians to attack at a run, not giving the feared Persian bowmen time to get ready, and the plan worked. The Persians were driven back into the sea, and the Spartans, who had arrived to help the Athenians, though much too late, couldn't believe the result and insisted on touring the battlefield to count the dead. But the Athenians knew they'd been lucky, and later put great effort into enlarging their army and their fleet. But it was a great moment in Greek history. It glorified war to an extent. And now in this book, I've chosen to read a very different sort of poem. It's about war, but it's about war in ancient China. Shows how universal the theme of war is. This is a poem from about 300 BC by the Chinese poet Chu Yuan, writing in 300 BC about, quite graphically, it's entitled Battle. See what you think of this. We grasp our battle spears, we don our breastplates of hide. The axles of our chariots touch, our short swords meet. Standards obscure the sun, the foe roll up like clouds. arrows fall thick, the warriors press forward. They menace our ranks, they break our line. The left-hand trace horse is dead, the one on the right is smitten. The fallen horses block our wheels, they impede the yoke horses, they grasp the jade drumsticks, they beat the sounding drums. Heaven decrees their fall, the dread powers are angry. The warriors all are dead, they lie on the moor field. They issued, but shall not enter. They went, but shall not return. The plains are flat and wide, the way home is long. Their swords lie beside them, their black bows in their hand. Though their limbs were torn, their hearts could not be repressed. They were more than brave, they were inspired with the spirit of Wu. Wu, of course, is the Chinese god of war. So that's a poem. It kind of glorifies war as well. And I end with a thought for the day. Today I ask that the world will one day become free of all wars. Well, it certainly hasn't happened yet, but that's a typical page from my book. So we're going to have a word about the poetry of war. As I said, it started way back when poetry started. Poetry was not just a way of being a historical record of a war, it was also a way of inspiring people, of recruiting people. And before writing was invented in the days of Homer, it was the only way of remembering what had happened, really. But Western literature has always continued in that sort of vein of talking about war factually, but also talking about the pain and the horrifying cost of war and the consequences of war. And when we get at some stages, like the 19th century, when England was extremely powerful, war was very much glorified and justified. The whole British Empire had to be justified. It was very, very aggressive the way this country conquered other nations. And poets like Kipling and Tennyson were very good at justifying what were really acts of aggression. And I mean, a typical example is Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, which is the story of a pretty disastrous battle, certainly disastrous for the Light Brigade during the Russian, with the war in the Crimea towards the end of the 19th century. I'll just give you an example of what that poem sounds like. Here we are, The Charge of the Light Brigade. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. It goes on like that a bit. Basically what it's saying is, what a great event it was, even though unfortunately a lot of people were killed rather unnecessarily. And that was quite a common way of talking about war up until the 20th century, really. It was only when we get to only a few years after that poem was written that we get into World War One and the absolute mayhem and slaughter and disastrous carnage that went on in World War One made really the whole nation rethink the idea of war, and the voice of the World War One poets is so very, very different from the voice of the 19th century poets. Let me give you an example. I mean, one can hardly talk about World War One poets without mentioning Wilfred Owen and his brutally realistic poem that must have shocked so many readers. I'm going to read now. It's a famous Dulce et decorum est, which of course is the Latin for it's a fine and righteous thing to die for one's country, is what it goes on to say. But Wilfred Owen, of course, was very disillusioned, and he served in the First World War, was repatriated with shell shock, went back and was killed, but he wrote some amazing poetry, partly while he was in hospital receiving treatment. Here is Dulce et decorum est. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime, dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind that wagon that we flung him in, and watch his white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile and incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory that old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. Wow. Just reading that makes me feel quite angry and sad and disillusioned about that, the horror of war. And, that's the power of poetry. It gives a completely different dimension to so many things. And those First World War poets, I think we have a lot to thank them for. And I think maybe it's time to have a little break and have a few questions and answers. I'll see if I can try and answer some of the questions that some of my friends have already put up on the screen. Thank you so much for these questions. Gosh, they're really, really quite profound, I think. James is going to give me the first of those questions. Okay?
Yep. If you could reinterpret one poem from the Great War era for a modern audience, which would it be and why? And I'd like to know how you would reinterpret it.
Right. Well, that's a great question, and thank you, KM, for asking that. The question, I would answer it right away with another Wilfred Owen poem, which is Anthem for Doomed Youth. The word disillusionment just screams at me every time I think of World War I poets. And I think, for me, sorry, I just want to make sure I'm answering the actual question. When I was at school, the poems we were given to look at were all of the type I first read, the 19th century glorification of war. Mind you, when I was at school, it was fairly soon after World War II. It was in the 1950s and 60s. But nobody ever mentioned to me the World War I poems. So I left school thinking war was wonderful, and we'd won World War I and II, and everything was great. And then I read the World War I poets, and I thought, my God, I've been wrong all the time. And this poem that I'm going to read now, Anthem for Doomed Youth, really shook me up and altered my whole approach to writing about pain and conflict. It's quite a short poem, but it always moves me emotionally when I read it. Here we are. What passing bells for those who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, no bells, nor any voice of mourning, save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling to them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall. Their flowers, the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk, a drawing down of blinds. That's, to me, that is probably the greatest poem about war ever written. And it had a huge influence on me, still does. So I hope that answers your first question. The second question.
Many war poets balance beauty and brutality in their verses. How do you think that tension shapes modern poetry as we know it today?
Yes, well, thank you again, KM. Of course, Homer, right at the beginning of poetry, balanced beauty and brutality in a very graphic way. There's tremendous beauty in some of his descriptions of young men being cut down, but equally absolutely vile descriptions of people having their faces chopped open and awful things. It's something that has shaped a lot of modern poetry, I think. It made modern poets realize they could go further, I think, than anyone had ever dared before. And if you consider the likes of Seamus Heaney or Sylvia Plath, even though she didn't so much write about war, the way they use shocking images sometimes. I mean, Sylvia Plath's poem "Daddy" about her father, I hate you, Daddy, or that sort of thing, or Seamus Heaney talking about the awful consequences of war, but also talking in beautiful verses about how hope and history sometimes meet. I think it shaped an awful lot of modern poetry. The realization that they could go further, so much further than people had done before. So I hope that answers that. The next question.
If you could reinterpret one poem from the Great War era for a modern audience, which would it be and why? This was the question I answered first. I apologise. I should have gone in order.
Right. Well, I think I've kind of answered that. I think maybe I'll move on and not go over that again. Thank you, KM, very much for your questions. Sanya has also asked some questions. Thank you, Sanya.
Sanya asks, what type of poetry do you enjoy the most and why?
Well, thank you. That's a difficult, I could answer that question over the course of probably a day, but I'll try and keep it short. The poetry I like, quite unashamedly, most of all, is Shakespeare. And I know that that may not please everybody, but I was brought up on Shakespeare. My family were into Shakespeare. I had an aunt who was actress who quoted Shakespeare to me endlessly, and at school I was made to learn Shakespeare, which I'm now grateful for. But to me, he has everything. So much beauty, so much hidden meaning, so much wonderful imagery, so much just a absolute masterclass in the use of the English language. And if I ever, am at a loss for describing something, I can turn to Shakespeare, and he has probably done it already. And I just, in a funny sort of way, reading Shakespeare means more to me than hearing it declaimed in a theatre. But even theatrical performances completely bowl me over too. But I think I've made my point. There's so much to Shakespeare I have yet to learn, and I can't get enough of him. Okay, the next question.
What advice would you give to someone who wants to start writing their own poetry?
Gosh, well, I have to say right away that I do write poetry, and I've even published a book of poems, not because I think I'm a great poet, but because I was just doing it to try and prove that you can get a lot of amusement and self-knowledge out of writing poetry. And anybody can write poetry, in my view. And I think more people should try, because it is, apart from anything else, it is an answer to boredom. Somebody said to me the other day, we don't know how to be bored anymore. We just pick up our phones and find something to amuse us. But if you actually pick up a pen instead and write a little poem, it's something that stays with you, gives you a different insight into things, and can actually be quite satisfying as well. I would say to anyone starting or wanting to write poetry, you can do it. Only you are the judge. It is not a competition in any way. It is primarily, it should be for your own satisfaction. And you will most likely discover amazing things about yourself the more you write. Try and write on a regular basis. Do not be dismayed or disappointed if you think your writing is not good enough. Keep returning to it and look at the side benefits. You're developing a whole new talent. You are finding a new source of amusement. You are on a voyage of self-discovery, and who knows, you may find a whole new source of pleasure, income, friends, and a whole new world. Poetry is the gateway, I think, to all kinds of things, including spirituality, and it's just a voyage of discovery. And I salute anybody who's thinking of starting that. So that's enough of that question, I think.
Lovely. Next question. Do you think novelists bring something different to poetry than traditional poets do?
I think perhaps a lot of novelists tend to, this may be a generalization that's completely wrong, but I think novelists can bring a sense of sort of structure to a poem, which they have learnt from, because writing a novel generally requires a lot of discipline and structure, and novelists can bring that to poetry. I'm thinking of people like Robert Graves or Thomas Hardy, for example, have been both brilliant novelists and brilliant poets as well. On the other hand, I think some novelists see poetry as a way of escape and release, and can write the sort of poetry that's completely different. And well, take Sylvia Plath, for example. She wrote a very remarkable novel, partly on her own experiences, of course, The Bell Jar, but she also wrote some astonishingly out-of-the-box sort of poetry that may have been a release from doing the more arduous work, well, possibly more arduous work of writing a novel. And there are probably others as well. So I think, yes, anybody brings a new dimension to poetry, and I think novelists most certainly do. Are there any other questions?
That's the last one. I have a question, if that's all right.
Yes, please.
So I'm a poet, but I'm a very undisciplined one. I tend to write in bursts when I'm quite emotional.
Yes.
And I want to get into a practice of writing regularly. And I wondered if you had any tips as to how I would begin one.
Well, I think you're quite right to plan to write regularly, and I think a lot of people. I'm thinking of, in particular, Ted Hughes, who used to write brilliant poetry, but he also used to sort of prime himself by reading. He used to, at one stage, he used to read a complete Shakespeare play every day. Every morning, he used to get up at 6 a.m. and read a play before breakfast. And other poets have done that as well. W.H. Auden, for example, used to regularly read a poem in the early morning before writing himself. He described it as a form of prayer, and other poets, I can't quite remember, but I would definitely keep writing. Don't be too judgmental of yourself, but equally be ready to revise what you have written. But don't be put off. Just be the other advice I always like is that wonderful quote from Flaubert, the great French novelist, who said something like, "Be disciplined and orderly in your life, so that you may be violent and unpredictable in your work, in your writing."
Yes.
And I think that's a great quote. So that's what I would say to that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Do we? I think one or two other people have.
As a writer, how often would you go back and read what you've written?
I would go back and revise it. Maybe ask somebody else to comment and revise it again. But I would not do it too much if I was going to publish it. And when I say if I was going to publish it, if I was going to self-publish it myself. Of course, if I hand it to an outside publisher who tells me I need to make revisions, I suppose I would make more. But I would try and trust my own judgment as much as possible, because otherwise you sort of find yourself doing what someone else wants rather than yourself. And some writers, a lot greater ones than me, have been very reluctant to allow any kind of alteration. I'm thinking of people like Salinger, who I think very much resented any sort of comment, and I'm sure there are others like that as well. So that's what I would say to that.
Lovely. Diana or Deanna asks, do you know The Panther by Rilke? I think it's sad but beautiful. And are there similar poems that you could recommend?
I'm afraid I don't know that. That's I'm continually finding poems I don't know, which is part of the joy of it all, actually. But since you've mentioned it, I will certainly after this be going to read it. So I'm not quite sure what sort of poems you mean. If you can expand on that, I'll come back to you.
Maybe that's your homework.
Okay.
KM asks, what inspired you to start writing poetry and sharing it on YouTube and the other social media platforms?
I think what inspired me to write, well, okay, what inspired me to write poetry was a very weird story, but I'll tell it to you. I was in rehab for getting myself sorted out for a bit of a problem with mood altering substances in my youth. And that was getting on for 40 years ago. But anyway, I found myself in a very bad state, isolated, angry, and unwilling to really do anything very much about myself. But I was in this rehab, refusing to talk to anybody. And the counselor, the therapist, in looking after me, said, well, if you won't talk to us, Christopher, perhaps you could write a poem about yourself. So I thought, all right, I'll try. And I came up with a very foolish and banal poem, which began something like, roses are red, violets are blue. I wish I wasn't here with you. Something. I do not like the things you say. I wish that you would go away. And it went on like that for a bit. And I presented it to my therapist, and he said, this is great. I was really surprised. He said, you have at last shown us a bit of what you are thinking and feeling. He said, you've shown us that you are angry, blaming other people, you want to run away, and you don't want to be here, and you're very reluctant to do anything about yourself. So now will you please go and talk to your colleagues in your therapy group and read this out to them. So I did, and they very gently and nicely told me what a self-defeating idiot I was, and they helped me to start trying to rebuild myself, my attitudes, and my life in general. And from that moment, I sort of got the idea that poetry could help me discover myself. And it all sort of went on from there. And it really changed my life, because poetry changed my attitude. It changed the way I felt. And in so doing, once you've changed your feelings and your attitudes, your behavior changes. And once your behavior changes, your whole life starts to change. And that's what happened to me. So, great question. Thank you for asking it.
That's it, I think.
Okay, well, if that's it, maybe if anybody has any other questions, we'll get back to them at the end.
We've got one more if you've got time.
Okay.
What usually sparks the first line of a poem for you? Is it an image, emotion, or a particular word or rhythm?
It could be anything. It could be something I've heard someone say. I think it's got to be, for me, because my poetry is mediocre. I make no excuses for that, so I have to sort of try and grab the attention. If somebody's a really, really great poet, they don't have to do that, I think. But if you're a very mediocre poet, you do need to grab the attention, I think. So I would try and find something that grabs the attention straight off as a first line. Um, I just um, a poem that I read fairly early on in my poetry writing career. It was a poem I wrote about my sort of change of from a mood-altering substance lover to a sort of happy, sober person. It started off indistinct to human eyes, a shadow on the pavement lies, and it went on to show that shadow was a shadow of my former self. So that's just one example. But yes, I always try to grab the attention. But as I keep saying, I'm sad to say, I may have other talents, but being a great poet, I'm afraid I'm not ever going to be remembered as that. But thank you for asking.
Diana just has some comments about the poem she mentioned, The Panther.
All right. Yeah.
Would you like me to read it?
Yes, please.
So she says it's a poem written around 1902. The panther symbolises spiritual imprisonment. I don't know much about English poems, only that also William Blake wrote one about a tiger.
Yes.
Tiger, tiger, burning bright.
Yes.
She said, I find it funny how humans play with animals to express the human condition.
Well, I think, you mentioned, thank you very much. That's a great comment. And animals do indeed play a huge part in poetry throughout the centuries. William Blake, I mean, absolutely, a lot of his poetry, a quote, a robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage, or Maya Angelou, I know why the caged bird sings. So many great poems use animal images, and tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night is another one. It's a great way of writing poetry, and going back to the previous question, you could do a lot worse than bring an animal in early on in your poetry writing, because it grabs the attention apart from anything else, and it's a great way of bringing imagery into a poem. So thank you for all your questions so far. I'm just going to go back to this theme of war poetry, because I think I've spoken about war poetry, talking about the consequences of war, but I wanted to touch on the other side of war poetry, which is about reconciliation and healing, because poetry is so powerful. It can be so inspirational to war, and I've just mentioned on that aspect of it, we're living with that sort of poetry today, whether we know it or not. If you take, for example, terrorism, which is a fact of life, sadly, today, and a lot of poetry has been written, recently. Islamic terrorism, for example, in the Middle East, there's a huge corpus of Islamic poetry starting, I'll just quote one here, which you find on the internet. This is a typical example. I will fasten my explosive belt, I will shudder like a lightning bolt, and rush by like a torrential stream, and resound like stormy thunder. In my heart is the heart of a volcano. I will sweep through the land like a flood, for I live by the Quran, and I remember the merciful. And to us, that's quite a shocking poem. But of course, we are the recipients of terrorism. And we perhaps need to remember, while, I'm not trying to belittle anything, but there was a time, maybe 800 years ago, when Western Europe were terrorizing the Middle East with crusades and writing and being inspired by poetry in a sort of similar vein, in hymns and songs of troubadours of the time. And many crusaders were doing appalling atrocities in the Middle East. And so, we need to remember that things come full circle sometimes. And the poetry that we look on now as perhaps quite horrific is to other people quite inspirational, just as many years ago, what was inspirational to us was probably quite horrific to the recipients of our terrorism. So there we are. That's another aspect of poetry, the inspirational. But of course, poetry is also very much a justifier of aggression, and we should remember that is very much in use today too. But I do want to move on and talk about the poetry of reconciliation and healing, because many people have used poetry to express, forgiveness and extremely noble sentiments in the face of appalling disasters. And I'll give you an example, and I'll give you more than one example, actually. If you take a dreadful event like the Twin Towers, 9/11, it was a world-changing event, and it affected many people and maybe sparked a lot of aggression as well. But it also drove some people to write poems of reconciliation and expressing a desire for peace, and asking people to try and move on. And I particularly like this one that was written by, I think, an American person who either had been a victim or knew victims of 9/11. It's a well-known poem. It's called "The Lady Cried," and I think it's referring there to the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, of course. I'm going to read it. It's called "The Lady Cried" by Alice Gaither. I think this is very fine. The golden door of freedom opens far and wide to welcome throngs of men and women who choose to come inside. One tragic September morn, the golden door was breached by terrorist visions and wild, attempting to destroy our nation and cast our freedom aside. The lady cried. We reflect on the chaos and ruin rendered that day, and mourn the loss of our nation's family. Amidst the rubble and ruin rendered that day, and the devastation, we stand united, looking to Our Lady as we pray to keep faith boundless and freedom alive. The lady cried. When we think about this tragedy, we feel a collective sadness for those who died. We pray for their families. We pray for the victims who were blessed to survive. As we attempt to help each other, each one heal, the balm of unity and strength must be applied. Our nation must band together. The lady cried. Let us tear down the walls that separate us, the walls of discrimination and hate, the walls of racial, cultural, and religious intolerance. We must embrace the value of humankind to keep our nation great, to keep the promise of liberty for one and all across each generation. And the binding cord of strength is ours in this, our great nation. The lady cried. I think that's a pretty wonderful poem by someone, who is noble enough to just not want revenge. Someone who's calling for reconciliation, something that can inspire us every bit as much as a call to fighting and war. And so many great poets have tried to put that point across, that we have to remember that we're human beings, and when it comes down to war is conflict, one to one, and so often we are fighting someone who could just as well be a friend, someone, who is another human being, as well as Wilfred Owen put it so well in his poem. He said in another poem, it seemed that out of battle I escaped down some profound dull tunnel, long since scooped through granite, through which titanic wars had groined. And I met a man. I am the enemy you killed, my friend. I knew you in this dark, for so you frowned. Yesterday, through me, as you jabbed and killed, I parried, but my hands were loathsome cold. Let us sleep now. All this by Thomas Hardy, The Man He Killed, it's called. He writes of two soldiers who might have been friends in ordinary life. Here's a part of it. Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to wet right many a nipperkin. But ranged as infantry and staring face to face, I shot at him as him at me, and killed him in his place. And here the poem ends with the tragic absurdity of it. Yes, quaint and curious war is. You shoot a fellow down. You shoot a fellow down. You treat it met where any bar is, or help to half a crown. Shows that poetry has the power to heal, and poetry is very much used as a form of therapy these days. In America particularly, there's a whole association for poetry therapy. They use it when people have experienced huge traumas of any kind of mass shooting or murder or tragic accidents. One of the things they ask people to do, sometimes the victims are so traumatized, they find it very hard to simply talk about their experiences, but they can sometimes write a poem about it. And that can be the gateway to opening up opening up themselves and starting the healing process, as W.H. Jordan put it. Let the healing fountain start. And poetry is, it's just a whole new dimension to so many things, I think. And I think we're getting towards the close of this live show. Do we have any more questions?
There are 2 questions, if you want to answer them just quickly.
Okay, sure.
Rob, I'm going to shorten that too, says,
Okay.
do you think poets wrote more to honour the fallen or to show how awful war really was?
Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you for coming on the show. And that's a great question. I think the answer is, I think many of them do both. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, I'm not sure. But I think that most great poems about war do end up showing honor to the fallen and also showing how awful war really is. And if they do that, then for me, they pass the test. I think if they really, I suppose if they fail to do either of those, then perhaps they're not doing their job. I would like to think that, hopefully, very few people these days just simply would glorify war and leave it at that, unless they're quite mad. That's my view anyway. Thank you for the question. Great question.
And last one, Ashley asks, are there any particular forms of poetry that you don't necessarily cotton to? I guess that means gel with.
I think the quick answer is no, Ashley. Thank you very much for asking. But I think all poetry is just great because it takes us out of the mundane into a whole new world. And I include in poetry, music, songs, rap, hymns. I often think ancient sort of poetry that monks used, sort of singing plain chant in church, is a sort of medieval form of what you would nowadays call rap. And I think it's great that poetry evolves in so many different ways. I think, the sort of modern poetry slam that people do with poetry performance is another great new thing that might have shocked the likes of Tennyson, I don't know, or even Shakespeare, though I like to think nothing would really have shocked Shakespeare. But no, I just think poetry, I look forward to new ideas. I think poetry with background music is another great way of sometimes experiencing it. And something, it's like all forms of art, I think it has to evolve, otherwise it just grows a bit stale and repetitive. So let's keep it evolving.
Cheers.
I don't know if that's anybody's and I like Louisa's comment. Hey, I'm a psychology student, and yes, poetry can heal. It's beautifully. I totally agree with you there, Louisa. Poetry certainly helped me heal, and I've seen it heal an awful lot of other people too. I've done creative writing and poetry writing sessions in rehabs around the country, and I've seen the power it has to help me. Someone's asking me if I have any memories on the war. Well, my earliest memory is of being in a wartime convoy coming back from India in 1942 and sitting in a big cabin with a lot of bunks and a lot of people looking frightened out of their lives and hearing the guns booming outside. And that was my first ever memory, I think. And then I remember being back in England in 1943 and hearing the guns. I was staying in my grandfather's house in Camberley and hearing the guns bombing and the bombs falling on Aldershot, I think, down the road, and possibly London in the distance. And that was pretty scary too. But of course, a lot of people were experiencing a lot of scary things in those times. So it's all part of what one is as one grows up. Thank you for asking. So I would just like to end by thanking you all. Thank you for your appreciation, Alusa. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, James, for your help and your questions and comments. And let's do it all again next week, Monday evening, 6 o'clock at the same time, if you have a mind to. Thank you all so much. See you again soon. Thank you for your comments too. Bye for now. Thank you. Bye, Jay.